everybody. I hope that you're well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 8 English lesson on adjectives and adverbs. And before we start, we're going to log on to aplusstudents.ca. Once you've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of English language arts. We're doing grade 8. And then we scroll down up until we get to our chapter of adjectives and adverbs. All right, so our chapter is adjectives and adverbs. Our subject is English language arts. We're doing grade 8. And in the lessons that we are going to be focusing on under the chapter of adjectives and adverbs is to choose between adjectives and adverbs. And we need to say, is the word an adjective or an adverb? All right. So when it comes to adjectives and adverbs, right? An adjective is a word that describes or modifies a noun or a pronoun. And adjectives, it often tells us what kind or it tells us how many. So once again, we said, or we say, that an adjective it is a word that either describes, or we can even say it modifies a noun or pronoun. And adjectives, right, they often tell us what kind, or they tell us how many. So what kind of the noun it is, or how many of the noun we have or is. And if we look at examples, right, of an adjective, which is a word that either describes or modifies a noun or pronoun, or just tells us more about the noun. And remember, a noun, it basically tells us about people, animals, places, or things, right? Which means that an adjective tells me more about a person, a place, an animal, or a thing, or describes a person, an animal, a place, or thing, or it modifies the person, animal, place, or thing, or the pronoun. And these adjectives, they either tell us what kind or they tell us how many. And if we look at examples, right, of adjectives, examples of, sentences with adjectives, then it says, the apples were delicious. The apples were delicious. And if we were to look at that specific sentence, right, it says the apples were delicious, then we need to ask ourselves, is the adjective telling us what kind of apple it is, or is the adjective telling us how many apples there is or are? And by looking at that sentence, we can say that it basically tells us what kind of apples they were. So it tells us what kind of apples they were. And if we were to identify what kind of apples they were, and then we can say they were delicious. So delicious is the word that tells us what kind of apples they were. It is our adjective that describes our apples. Okay, we could have said green apples, we could have said red apples, could have said bitter apples, sweet apples, but delicious apples. So that is our adjective. And that describes our apples. It tells us what kind of apples they were. And remember also when it comes to adjectives, right? Not only does the adjective tell us or ask us what kind, it also tells us how many. So it also tells us how many. So we can maybe say the apples were delicious. So delicious tells us what kind of apples they were. Or we can even say, I ate 5 apples. I ate 5 apples. So now, how many apples did you eat? 5. And 5 is the word that tells us how many apples you ate or how many apples they were. And that is adjective. It's words that either describes the noun or it modifies the noun or the pronoun. And then we have an adverb. Then we have an adverb, and an adverb, once again, is a word that describes or modifies a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. So keeping in mind that an adjective, it describes a noun, whereas an adverb describes the verb or an adjective or another adverb. And adverbs they often tell us how or when or where, to what extent, or even to what degree. That's an adverb. So we said an adverb is a word that either describes the verb or modifies the verb, or describes or modifies an adjective, or describes or modifies another adverb. And we said adverbs, they often tell us how. They tell us when, where, to what extent, or even to what degree. That is an adjective. And if we look at an adverbs, right? If we look specifically at adverbs, it tells us how. Remember, we say that adverbs they tell us how, they tell us when, they tell us where, to what degree, and to what extent, right? And if we look at an example, it says Grace ran quickly. Grace ran quickly. And if you look at the sentence that says Grace ran quickly, we need to ask ourselves, how did Grace run? And then if we were to identify how Grace ran, then we can say it's quickly. So which means that the adverb, right, it really tells us how Grace ran. And quickly is the word that tells us how Grace ran. And most of our adverbs, right, they tell you, most of the adverb that tells that basically that ends in ly, they in ly, that basically tells us it is the adverbs that tells us how it was done: quickly, hurriedly, softly, quietly. But then again, you can't always use ly to tell whether a word is either an adjective or an adverb. For example, she arrives soon. All right. So we said once again, let's just recap before we go to our test. We said an adjective is a word that describes or modifies a noun or pronoun. Adjectives, they tell us what kind, or it tells us how many. And remember, when it comes to how many, you can say words like several. There are several books. Or we can say there's 5 books, 2 books. But either way, when it comes to how many, you can even use words like several, a lot, much, or a specific number. All right, so now we're going to aplusstudents.ca, and we're going to choose between adjectives and adverbs. All right, so now we are here by aplusstudents.ca, and we're now going to choose the word that best describes or modifies the verb. And remember, a word that describes or best or modifies a verb is an adverb, right? An adverb is a word that describes or modifies a noun. So we're going to identify the adverb within the sentence. It says the soldier. So we need to say the what soldier faced difficult challenges during his service in the military. Do we say the couragely soldier, or do we say the courageous soldier? faced difficult challenges during his services in the military. So we need to choose the correct option. Is it the completely soldier faced difficult challenges during his service in the military, or the courageous soldier? Which one is correct? All right. And if we were to choose the correct option, we would say the courageous soldier. So the courageous soldier. Yes, well done. Courageous is correct. So the courageous soldier faced difficult challenges during his service in the military. Well done. Courageous is correct. All right. Let's look at the next one. It says Mr. and Mrs. Burton. We need to add a word over here. Do we say they recent purchased the house, or do we say they recently? So they recent purchased a house, or they recently purchased a cottage, sorry, on Lake Michigan. So Mr. and Mrs. Burton recent purchased a cottage on Lake Michigan, or recently purchased a cottage on Lake Michigan. So Mr. and Mrs. Burton, we can say recently purchased a cottage in Lake Michigan. So recently is correct. So they recently purchased or bought a cottage. So well done. The next one says choose the word that best describes or modifies a verb. It says the young lawyer. The young lawyer misplaced a highly important legal document, but he found it just in time for the trial. So do we say the young lawyer? So young lawyer, do we say accident, misplaced a highly important legal document, or accidentally misplaced a legal document? So which one is correct? Accident or accidentally? And if we were to choose the correct option, we would say the young lawyer accidentally misplaced a highly important legal document, but he found it just in time for the trial. So, accidentally. All right, so now we're going to our test. And we're going to choose between an adjective and an adverb. All right, we need to choose the word that best describes or modifies the verb. Do we say Mr. and Mrs. Burton recently, option one, purchased a cottage on Lake Michigan, or option two, recent purchased a cottage on Lake Michigan? Which one is correct? Option one or option two, recently or recent? All right, and if we were to choose the correct option, we will say Mr. and Mrs. Burton recently. So recently purchased a cottage on Lake Michigan. All right, and recently is correct. The next one says we need to choose the word that best describes or modifies the verb. Elena thought for a moment And then she responded, do we say intelligently to Mrs. Khan's question, or intelligent to Mrs. Khan's question? We need to choose the correct option. Is it option 1, intelligently, or option 2, intelligent? And if we were to choose the correct option, then we can say that Elena thought for a moment and then she responded intelligently to Mrs. Khan's question. Intelligently. The next one says we need to choose the word that best describes or modifies the verb. Mayor Hurst, do we say ready signed off on the committee's plan, or readily signed off on the committee's plan to fund the construction of a new bridge? So Mayor Hurst, do we say ready signed off or readily signed off on the committee's plan to fund the construction of a new bridge? Which one is correct? And if we were to choose the correct option, and then we can say Mayor Hurst readily signed off on the committee's plan to fund the construction of a new bridge. Already. Okay, it's ready, not readily. So that was my mistake. Ready, signed off. Already, ready. All right, the next one says Josh and Denise sell their handmade crafts at bazaars around the county. So we said Josh and Denise, do we say sometimes sell or occasional sell their handbags or their handmade crafts at the bazaar around the county? Do we say sometimes, or sometimes Josh and Denise sell, or occasional they sell? So which one is correct? The word that modifies the verb. So we can even say, or do we say sometimes Josh and Denise sell their handmade crafts, or occasional they sell? I think let's go with sometimes because I think it would be occasionally. All right, yes, and sometimes is correct. And the last one says, do we say the courageous soldier faced difficult challenges during his service in the military, or do we say the courageously soldier faced difficult challenges during his service in the military? So option one, courageous, or option two, courageously. And if we were to choose the correct option, then we can say the courageous soldier describes and tells us what kind of soldier it is. The courageous soldier faced difficult challenges during his service in the military. All right, so now we need to say, is the word an adjective or an adverb? We had to choose the word. Now we're going to say, is the word an adjective or an adverb? All right, let's go to our test. We now need to say, is the word in bold either an adjective or is it an adverb? My neighbor, who is unusually tall, is always cautious around ceiling fans. So my neighbor, who's unusually tall, is always cautious around fans. So which one is this an adjective unusually or is it an adverb? And if we were to choose whether it is an adjective or an adverb, if they say unusually tall, then it's supposed to be an adjective because it describes the neighbor. Adverb. But if it describes the person, then why is it an adverb? Okay. Because unusually tall, okay, unusually it tells us how, but tall, oh, unusually it describes the height of the neighbor. It basically tells us about the adjective. Remember, we said an adverb, it either tells us more about the verb or describes the adjective or describes another adverb. So they didn't describe the boy itself, but they described or they told us how tall he is. All right, so that is why it's an adverb. So that is why you need to also keep that in mind, right? As much as the adjective describes the noun, but sometimes is a word that tells us more about the adjective or word that tells us more about an adverb. So in that case, unusually was telling us more about the tallness or the height of the person, which means that it was actually describing the adjective. That was unusually. That is why it was an adverb. All right. The next one says the bald eagle, the Liberty Bell, and the American flag are all considered patriotic symbols of the United States. So the word patriotic, is it an adjective or an adverb? Patriotic. And if we were to choose the correct option, then we can say patriotic is an adjective. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson on adjectives and adverbs. We said an adjective is a word that describes or modifies a noun, right? It tells us more about a person, animal, place, or thing, describes the person, animal, place, or thing, or tells us more about that noun or pronoun, right? Adjectives, they either tell us what kind or they tell us how many. And then we also have adverbs. In adverbs, it tells us more or describes the verb, or it describes or tells us more about an adjective or another adverb, right? And when it comes to adverbs, adverbs they often tell us how, they tell us when, they tell us where, they tell us to what degree or to what extent. And most times when the adjective ending that tell the adjectives that tells us how, they end in ly, right? But also keeping in mind, right, when we say that an adjective it tells us more or describes an adjective, then it means that you'll find an adjective that describes a noun, but then there'll be a word that basically tells us more about the adjective, like we saw earlier on in our test. All right, so this is the end of our lesson on adjectives and adverbs. Thank you very much for joining the class, and I really hope you're going to have a good evening further. So, till next time, have a good day. Goodbye.